Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in a flashbang grenade, drag you out, put you in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint, all because they actually got the wrong house. Now here's the kicker: when you tried to hold the government accountable for the mistakes of the federal agents, the government argues that they can't be sued because their agents had discretion to plan the raid and get the wrong house. This is the exact situation that made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and the court handed down a 9-0 unanimous ruling that could have major implications not just for this family, but also for gun owners going forward. So let's break down what happened in this critical case and what is now happening going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to simply subscribe to the channel. That of course helps the channel to grow. And then also just double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you, because they love to do that, especially on Second Amendment channels. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a recent 9-0 unanimous ruling issued by the Supreme Court, which all gun owners should actually be aware of. This case is called Martin versus United States, and it comes out of a suburban Atlanta area where back in 2017, the FBI executed a pre-dawn raid against a home. However, the only problem was that they got the wrong address. Now, in response to this, the family inside that home sued the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. Now, the question that the Supreme Court had to address was whether the federal government gets to walk away from liability, or can someone actually sue them and try to hold the federal agency accountable for the wrongdoing of one of their agents when they make a mistake like this one. This case was recently remanded to the 11th Circuit for a new ruling in light of what the Supreme Court said in that 9-0 ruling. Additional supplemental briefs are currently due at the end of next week. I believe it's going to be November 21st. But recently, also an amicus brief was filed by Professor Gregory Sisk, a leading scholar on civil litigation against the federal government and a member of the Federalist Society. In the amicus brief, he pushes for the 11th Circuit to overrule their prior analysis regarding the discretionary function exception in the FTCA. And this type of argument made by the plaintiffs here, Katrina Martin and her family, against the FBI and the agents that engaged in this mistake and this wrongful raid. Now, here's what happened in this case. FBI Special Agent Lawrence Guerrera was tasked with leading a pre-dawn raid against a home where suspected gang members were believed to be hiding. The target address was a specific address, but instead of just going there or double checking, he put that address into his personal GPS. However, the issue was that the GPS routed him to a completely different address, and it took him to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend at the time and their 7-year-old son. When the FBI agents arrived at the home without warning, they smashed in the front door, threw in some flashbang grenades, and then went through the home, pulled out the boyfriend who was hiding in a closet, pulled out Katrina Martin, put her in handcuffs, pointed a gun at her head, and they pulled her out essentially half dressed as well, and then they pulled out the 7-year-old son as well. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a search of the home. Now, while performing the search of the home, one of the agents noticed that there was some mail on a coffee table, and he noticed that the address on that mail was a completely different location. And that's when they had this huge oh crap moment that we raided the wrong home. In response to this, the family sued the federal government, and they brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA, which is a law that allows people, citizens, to sue the federal government for certain wrongful acts that federal employees engage in when they're acting on behalf of that agency. But the FTCA comes with a long list of exceptions where essentially the federal government has also carved out where you can't sue us in these specific situations. One of those at issue in this case is called the discretionary function exception. That exception shields the federal government when the wrongful act stems from an official or an agent acting and making a discretionary decision, meaning a decision that involves judgment, choice, or policy considerations. So in this case, the family tried to sue the FBI for the agent's actions under the FTCA, but the government claimed that they fell under the exception, the discretionary function exception in the FTCA, because it was within the agent's discretion to use the GPS and get the wrong address. Now, eventually, like I mentioned, this case made its way all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and on review, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the family. The Supreme Court, in that unanimous opinion written by Justice Gorsuch, vacated the 11th Circuit's ruling and sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit for a new decision in light of what they just said. The Supreme Court held first that the law enforcement proviso only modifies the intentional tort exception. It does not override all the exceptions in the FTCA. Essentially, the FBI was trying to say that this one provision within the FTCA about law enforcement discretion and these types of things should apply to all the FTCA, but the Supreme Court said no, that's only for that one section. Second, the Supreme Court vacated and remanded the case back to the 11th Circuit for rebriefing and new decisions on whether the discretionary function exception bars the Martins' negligent and intentional tort claims from what happened with the FBI doing the wrong house raid. Recently, the DOJ was able to get an extension on having to file their supplemental response brief, and they have until November 21st. They argued because of the government shutdown, they should get more time. They were granted that more time. But with the government shutdown now over, they're going to have to submit those supplemental briefs by the end of next week. However, like I mentioned, a recent amicus brief was filed in this case on behalf of Katrina Martin and the family, and it pushes for the 11th Circuit to rule in their favor. Now, in this brief written by that professor, he states that the Federal Tort Claims Act promised to waive federal sovereign immunity for common law torts committed by government employees. Decades worth of case law misinterpreting the FTCA's discretionary function exception have reduced that promise to an empty gesture. He argues that there is a misreading and misapplication of Supreme Court precedents, and it has led to lower courts misapplying the discretionary function exception. And essentially that means that for a government action to be protected, they need only actually show that it is susceptible to policy analysis. He points out under this approach, the government is per se immune unless the plaintiff here in a case can overcome every single hypothetical policy connection that is put forward by the federal government for what happened in the case. He states that this court now has a rare opportunity to right the ship that it helped set off course over the past 3 decades. And also, the court should put this back into place of being an exception rather than broad immunity. He argues that this discretionary exception should only apply when actually grounded in social, economic, and political policy, not every single hypothetical connection that a government puts forward. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with the Second Amendment? What does this have to do with gun owners? Well, here's why this is critical. Wrong house raids, mistaken identity arrests, and excessive force situations disproportionately impact law-abiding gun owners. When a raid goes bad, they can lead to deadly consequences. If the federal government can hide behind broad discretion every single time that they mess up, well, then there's no accountability, and the FTCA is not functioning as intended by Congress. The Supreme Court's ruling in Martin narrows the government's ability to avoid lawsuits by claiming broad immunity under this type of discretionary exception, and it was never meant to have this broad immunity. It was supposed to be a limited exception that could be called upon by the federal government when they fell under that specific scenario for the exception. But again, it's not meant to be broad immunity, giving them immunity under every single situation by claiming some sort of hypothetical connection to policy. This case reinforces that the federal government can be held accountable when they recklessly invade someone's home or misuse their power. So that is what's now happening in this case after another critical 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court. And now this is going to head back to the 11th Circuit. Like I mentioned, the 11th Circuit has requested supplemental briefs, which are due now by the end of next week, November 21st. It's going to be interesting to see, what does the federal government argue as far as the discretion connection now, because they are kind of more narrowed into having to prove that by the Supreme Court. And it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out now in the 11th Circuit. So as we get more information, as this develops more, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, you can check out one of the 2 videos here on the screen that the YouTube algorithm thinks that you'll find helpful. But as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.